What if I told you that changing one single day of the week triggered the corruption of Christianity itself? That moving worship from Saturday to Sunday wasn't just a minor adjustment, but the first domino that led to indulgences, purgatory, and centuries of spiritual abuse. Today we're diving deep into a sermon that claims the Sabbath isn't just about rest, it's the weekly heartbeat of the Creator, the memorial of the cross, and the final test before judgment closes. By the end of this episode, you'll understand why this preacher believes Sunday worship is a lie that's dividing denominations, and why the Sabbath question will determine who stands with God in the end times. Let me bring in my co-host to unpack this explosive claim.
This sermon starts with a haunting question from Psalm 11:3. If the foundations be destroyed, what can the righteous do? And according to this preacher, the Sabbath is one of those foundations that's been destroyed. He's not talking about the Sabbath as just a day off or a religious tradition. He calls it the weekly heartbeat of the Creator, the memorial of the Redeemer, the sign of the covenant.
Wait, the weekly heartbeat of the Creator? That's pretty intense language. What does he mean by that exactly?
He's saying the Sabbath is woven into the very fabric of creation itself. In Genesis, God rested on the seventh day, not because he was tired, but as what the sermon calls the signature at the bottom of the masterpiece. It's the seal of creation, the seventh-day exhale of a God who delights in his work.
So he's arguing that when you remove the Sabbath, you're not just changing a day, you're making creation itself negotiable.
Exactly. The sermon says when the Sabbath is lost, suddenly the seven-day creation becomes symbolic. The literal week becomes poetic. The Creator becomes a concept. And here's the kicker. If I'm not created by God, then I'm not accountable to God. If I'm not accountable to God, I'll be shaped by the world instead of by God.
That's a pretty direct line from Sabbath observance to personal identity. But he doesn't stop there, does he? There's also this redemption angle.
Right. He brings in Deuteronomy 5, where God gives a second reason for the Sabbath. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt. Therefore, the Lord your God commands you to keep the Sabbath day. So it's not only a creation memorial, it's a redemption memorial. It says you were slaves, but I freed you. You were burdened, but I lifted you.
And without that weekly reminder of redemption, what happens?
According to the sermon, redemption becomes sentimental, quote, a Hallmark card instead of a Passover lamb. Grace becomes a feeling instead of a deliverance. The cross becomes a symbol instead of a sacrifice. It's pretty harsh language, but he's saying without the Sabbath, Christianity loses its transformational power.
Now here's where it gets really controversial. He's claiming that grace becomes detached from obedience when the Sabbath is lost. That sounds like he's pushing back against the whole grace means you don't need to obey message.
Absolutely. He quotes Jesus saying, if you love me, keep my commandments. Paul saying, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. And James saying, faith without works is dead. His argument is that grace isn't the cancellation of obedience, it's the restoration of obedience. Grace empowers obedience rather than excusing us from it.
So in his view, when the Sabbath disappears, grace becomes permission instead of transformation?
Exactly. Permission instead of transformation, excuse instead of empowerment, license instead of liberation. And he says this makes Christianity detached from Christ himself. It's a pretty bold claim that the Sabbath is essential to understanding what grace actually does.
But here's where the historical argument gets really explosive. He's saying the change from Saturday to Sunday wasn't made by Christ or the apostles or scripture, it was made by tradition. And that opened the floodgates to corruption.
This is where he really goes after the institutional church. He says, once tradition replaced revelation, the door opened for indulgences, penances, purgatory, human mediators, ecclesiastical supremacy, persecution, corruption, spiritual abuse. The Sabbath was the first domino, and once it fell, others followed.
That's a pretty sweeping historical claim. He's essentially saying that changing the Sabbath led to the Dark Ages?
That's exactly what he's arguing. When the authority of God gets replaced by the authority of man, the church becomes a political institution instead of a spiritual body. And he says history shows what happened next. Millions died, conscience was crushed, scripture was chained, the beast power rose.
Wait, he brings up the beast power? That's Revelation language. How does the Sabbath connect to end times prophecy?
This is where it gets really intense. He says the Sabbath was not merely changed, it was attacked, because it's the sign of God's authority. And later in the sermon, he connects this to Daniel 12:1, where Michael stands up. He claims Michael stands up when the commandments of God are trampled and the Sabbath is desecrated.
So he's saying Sabbath desecration is literally the final straw before probation closes?
That's his claim. Because the Sabbath is the sign of loyalty, the seal of God, the mark of his authority, the identity of his people. When the world enforces a counterfeit day and God's people stand firm in the true day, the universe sees who belongs to the Lamb.
But let's step back to something more practical. He talks about rest becoming optional instead of covenantal. What does that mean for how we actually live?
He's saying God didn't say, remember the Sabbath day if it fits your schedule or if your job allows it. He said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Rest isn't optional, it's covenantal. It's identity, protection, spiritual warfare.
Spiritual warfare? How is taking a day off spiritual warfare?
Because the Sabbath is a weekly declaration. I am not a slave to work, not a slave to culture, not a slave to productivity, not a slave to Pharaoh, not a slave to Babylon, not a slave to the beast. I belong to God. It's resistance against the systems that want to own your time and identity.
And he connects this to pride somehow?
Yeah, he says when people lose the Sabbath protection, performance becomes identity, work becomes salvation, pride becomes religion. And pride is the spirit of the beast, the prince of pride from the book of Job. When pride rises, the covering falls.
There's also this really interesting connection he makes between losing the Sabbath and love growing cold. How does that work?
He quotes Jesus saying, because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall grow cold. His argument is that the Sabbath is the weekly practice of love. You rest so others can rest. You stop so others can breathe. You value others above yourself. Sabbath keepers make other people's lives easier.
So when that weekly rhythm of considering others disappears, community starts to break down?
Exactly. He says when the Sabbath is lost, community collapses, compassion weakens, relationships fracture, families drift, churches divide, society hardens. Because you lose that weekly practice of lifting burdens, honoring the weary, protecting the vulnerable, modeling heaven.
But here's something that really caught my attention. He says the Sabbath is the memorial of the cross. How does that work?
This is beautiful, actually. He points out that Jesus rested in the tomb on the Sabbath. The Creator rested after creation. The Redeemer rested after redemption. So the Sabbath becomes the weekly reminder that it is finished. Without the Sabbath, the cross becomes just a symbol instead of a victory.
That's a connection I've never heard before. The Sabbath as a weekly celebration of the finished work of the cross.
And he says it will remain that way for eternity. He quotes Isaiah 66, 2-23. From one Sabbath to another, all flesh shall come to worship before me. Even in heaven, with no sin, no sorrow, no death, no persecution, the Sabbath remains as the eternal reminder of creation, redemption, and the cross.
So he's saying the Sabbath is the rhythm of eternity itself?
That's exactly his claim. The Sabbath isn't temporary, it's eternal. It's not just Jewish, it's universal. It's not optional, it's essential. And soon, from one Sabbath to another, all flesh will worship before the Lord.
Now, he also warns about persecution coming for Sabbath keepers. What's that about?
He says, in the last days, Jesus warned, you will be hated for my name's sake. He claims evangelicals who cling to tradition will attack those who cling to the Sabbath, not because Sabbath keepers are harsh, but because they expose the emptiness of tradition. Light irritates eyes accustomed to darkness.
That's pretty provocative. He's essentially saying that defending Saturday Sabbath will make you a target.
Right, and he connects this back to the beast power and end times enforcement. When the world enforces a counterfeit day, presumably Sunday, those who stand firm in the true day become the visible sign of who belongs to God versus who belongs to the system.
Let's talk about his conclusion. He says, we're living in the final moments of Earth's history and the foundations are shaking. What's his call to action?
He says God still has a people who remember creation, honor redemption, obey by grace, follow revelation, not tradition, rest in covenant, not convenience, taste the peace of heaven every week, cling to the cross, and delight in the Sabbath.
And these are the people who will stand when the world bows?
Exactly. He says the Sabbath is not a burden, but a blessing, not legalism, but liberation, not old covenant, but eternal covenant. And these people who keep it will be the ones who stand, rest, delight, obey, love, shine, wait, hope, and proclaim until the end.
This is pretty heavy stuff. He's basically saying that the Sabbath question is the ultimate test of loyalty to God versus human tradition.
That's his core argument. The Sabbath is the sign that we belong to the Creator, the Redeemer, and the coming King. It's not just about which day you go to church, it's about whether you follow God's authority or human authority when they conflict.
What strikes me is how he connects everything back to this one issue: creation, redemption, grace, authority, rest, love, the cross, end times, all flowing through the Sabbath question.
Right. He's not treating this as an isolated doctrine. He's saying when you change God's Sabbath, you're rewriting God's story. And when humanity rewrites God's story, humanity loses its own story. Everything unravels from that one foundational change.
And he sees this playing out in denominational divisions today?
Absolutely. He's saying that proclaiming Sunday as the Sabbath is a lie and the cause of so many denominations. Because once you accept that human tradition can override divine command on something this fundamental, where do you draw the line? What other traditions become acceptable?
It's interesting how he frames this as being about children and perpetual generations too. There's this idea that the Sabbath reminds our children who God is.
Yeah, he calls it an eternal covenant that reminds our children in perpetual generations who God is and what he brings to this fallen world. It's not just personal, it's generational. The Sabbath becomes the weekly teaching moment about God's character and his relationship with humanity.
So when you step back from all this, what's the bigger picture he's painting?
He's painting a picture of cosmic conflict where the Sabbath becomes the final battleground. It's not just about religious preference, it's about whether you'll follow God's authority when the whole world is going the other direction. The Sabbath becomes the visible sign of where your ultimate loyalty lies.
And he believes this will literally determine who stands with God when Michael stands up in the end times?
That's his claim. When the judgment closes, when the sealing is complete, when the controversy reaches its climax, the Sabbath question will reveal who has the seal of God versus who has the mark of the beast. It's the ultimate test of obedience versus tradition.
This sermon definitely doesn't pull any punches. Whether you agree with it or not, it presents a pretty comprehensive case for why the Sabbath matters way beyond just picking a day to go to church.
Absolutely. He's connecting the Sabbath to creation, identity, redemption, grace, authority, community, love, the cross, and end times prophecy. It's not a side issue, in his view. It's the issue that reveals everything else about your relationship with God.
And the stakes couldn't be higher in his telling. The Sabbath as the weekly heartbeat of the Creator, the memorial of the cross, and the final test before judgment closes. Whether you're convinced or not, you have to admit that's a pretty compelling framework for understanding why this Seventh-day preacher believes Saturday Sabbath isn't just tradition, but the very foundation of faith itself.
Exactly. And his final message is that God still has a people who will stand when the foundations are shaking, who will choose revelation over tradition, who will rest in covenant rather than convenience, and who will delight in the Sabbath as the sign that they belong to the Creator, Redeemer, and coming King. That's his call, to be part of that remnant people.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Co-Pilot Podcasts. Whether this sermon challenges your thinking or confirms what you already believe, one thing is clear: the question of which day is God's Sabbath isn't going away. And according to this preacher, how you answer that question will determine where you stand when the final test comes. Thanks for diving deep with us into these foundational issues that just might shake everything you thought you knew about faith, authority, and what it really means to follow God.